Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Happy Musicians Podcast, where it's not about getting the gig, it's about enjoying the gig. I'm your host, Tanner Guss, and this week I'm joined by Meagan Johnson. Meagan is a singer, choral conductor, voice educator, and she's a certified Alexander Technique teacher. Over the last decade, Meagan has explored the application of the Alexander Technique for choral rehearsals, in her voice studio, and just in the day-to-day work of a musician. And if you don't know what the Alexander Technique is, you're not alone. I did not really know what it was either, and this conversation was incredibly helpful to get a better idea for it. And she even walks us through a couple of exercises that the technique can offer, and so you can get a taste of it and see if it's something that you'd like to explore further. In our conversation, we also talk about how to find a teacher. We talk about the applications of the Alexander Technique for performance anxiety. We talk about taking your play seriously and the problems of overly goal-oriented learning. This is a pretty amazing conversation. She shares some awesome insight, and I'm so excited that you get to hear it now. Thank you for being here, and please welcome Meagan Johnson. Meagan Johnson, welcome to the Happy Musicians Podcast.
Thanks so much, Tanner.
Yeah, really excited about this. I think we should just, right off the bat, try to give maybe a definition of the Alexander Technique, because I think many people have heard of it, but myself included don't really understand exactly what it is.
Sure. So the Alexander Technique is a way of unlearning harmful habits of tension, of paying attention to yourself in all of your daily activities, whether those are going about your everyday life or making music, and of a kind of embodied mindfulness that gives you conscious control over your actions and how you use yourself.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like something that every musician could use a lot of.
It's so helpful.
Yeah, I believe it. And maybe one of the helpful things we could do is maybe go through a small example of what that might look like for people.
Sure.
So if you're driving, maybe this isn't something you should tune into, but if you're listening at home, this is something we could all try out.
Although, actually, you could probably do this when you're driving, as long as you also keep part of your attention on the space around you and what's happening on the road. So this is an exercise I often do at the beginning of workshops or when I'm giving a class. I also do this with my private Alexander Technique students. And I'm going to ask you to think a phrase to yourself 3 times in your own mind. Repeat it. And notice what you notice about yourself. Notice what's happening in your body. Notice what's happening in your thinking, in your breathing, anything that's in your attention. The first phrase is, I have to do it right, and I have to do it fast. Notice what you notice when you think, I have to do it right, and I have to do it fast. So we'll come back to your observations about that in a moment. But now I want to give you the opposite thought exercise, which is, I'm at ease in myself and I have time. What do you notice about yourself when you think, I'm at ease in myself and I have time? So, folks listening on the podcast, you might note, what were the differences in what you noticed in your body when you thought, I have to do it right and I have to do it fast, versus I'm at ease in myself and I have time? I don't know, Tanner, do you want to chime in with anything you noticed about yourself?
Yeah, definitely I felt anxious and kind of leaning forward on the edge of my seat when I'm thinking that I need to do this quickly and correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it was also just the fact that telling myself that I have time and I'm at ease reminded me that that's where I want to be.
Right.
And I was able to come into a bit of grace in that moment, which was cool.
Sure. Yeah. And those are really common things that people observe in themselves, to notice an increase in anxiety, an increase in heart rate, or a tightening of breathing, tightening of shoulders when we're thinking, I have to do it right and I have to do it fast. And often when people think, I'm at ease in myself and I have time, they notice a releasing of some of that tension, or they notice a deepening of their breath. And so the question I usually follow up with is, which set of conditions is most conducive to learning and performing music? Is it the one where you are experiencing increased tension and increased anxiety, or the one where you're feeling a little bit more calm and at ease in yourself. Most people say, oh, I would definitely like the one where I'm noticing less tension. And so it's instructive for us to notice the immediate connection between our thoughts and what's happening in our bodies. In the Alexander technique, there is no distinction between what's happening in your mind and what's happening in your body. F.M. Alexander, after whom the technique is named, called us a psychophysical unity. That is a unity of our mind and our thoughts and of our bodies and our actions, and that all of that together is our self, our one undivided self. And so we can change what's happening in our bodies with our thinking, and we can change what's happening in our thinking with how we use our bodies, which is really powerful and profound.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious how you came about getting into the practice.
Absolutely.
And did you start out, well, you started as a performer first and then found that. So maybe we could talk about you getting into it and then what changed for you as a performer upon learning this technique.
Sure. So I started my music education as a music education and voice performance double major. So I was, performing in choral ensembles and auditioning for opera roles and giving recitals, and everything seemed to be going fine until later in my undergraduate career, I hit a technical wall. One of those places where the technique I had been using up to that point in my life was no longer working, and I didn't seem to be able to progress. And my attitude, my way of using my thinking habitually was, well, okay, I'll just work harder. I'll dig in. I'm going to push through this. I'm going to make it to the other side. And if we have any other vocalists listening to the podcast, you know that increasing tension and pushing through does not help your voice. In fact, I started to regress technically. I didn't make it into some of the graduate schools that I auditioned for. And it was a real wake-up call for me that pushing through my technique was not going to serve me in the long run, and that there were some things that I needed to change. Fortunately, I did find a really terrific graduate program to work in, and as part of that program, I started to study different ways of using somatic practices that encompass the whole body and mind as a way of improving my singing. And I was fortunate that in my undergraduate studies, I had been exposed to the Feldenkrais method. There was a wonderful Feldenkrais teacher on our voice faculty. And I had also been exposed to the Alexander technique. And so in my graduate program, I started to compare them. What's the same? What's different? What works for me? What doesn't? And I decided that the Alexander technique just really matched my way of learning and my way of thinking in the world. One of the things I love about the Alexander technique is that you can apply it in any activity. I didn't have to set aside an hour for just working on Alexander technique every day. I could do it while I was washing my dishes. I could practice Alexander technique while I was walking to class. I could practice Alexander technique while I was driving. And for me, the ability to incorporate what I was learning in my Alexander technique lessons as I started to study privately really started to change what was happening in my singing and in my music making. So for me, Alexander technique helped me to become not only a musician who had more ease and more freedom in my performing, but it also made me a more patient, a more calm, and a more emotionally resilient person. So Alexander technique, I thought, oh, this is going to help me with my jaw tension. This is going to help me with my neck tension and my breathing tension. And not only did it support those changes, those things did change, but I also found myself being able to be more centered when I was performing or when I was teaching or in any other potentially stressful situation.
Yeah, amazing. And did you have some kind of formal teacher for
Absolutely.
this? Okay.
Yes. So the Alexander technique is something you can read about in a book, but the best way to learn it is one-on-one with a certified teacher. And so I started working with a certified Alexander technique teacher and took lessons about every week, maybe every other week, in conjunction with my voice training. I was also taking voice lessons at the time. And then after I left graduate school, moved to a different city, I realized that I wanted to not only continue with my Alexander technique learning, but to train to be a teacher so that I could help other people in the same way that I found such benefit in the Alexander technique. And Alexander technique teacher certification through the American Society for the Alexander Technique is a 3-year, 1,600-hour teacher certification process. So it's an intensive learning, typically happens outside of a university or conservatory setting. There are a couple places where you can do those at the same time. And you learn about yourself. You learn your habits of movement. You learn to change those habits of how you move and how you think and how you walk. And then after you have started to become more efficient and more at ease in yourself, you then can learn how to teach others.
In addition to the performing and choral conducting you do now, you also teach at IU in a class that integrates these kind of techniques with musical performance, right?
That's right. Yeah, I teach a class at the IU Jacob School of Music that is called Postural Alignment for the Musician. I didn't come up with that title, but actually it has given us a great window into how musicians think about their posture, because a lot of times what people understand about the Alexander technique is that it helps you with your posture. It helps you change your posture. It helps you have better posture. But our posture is not just about our bodies and where the parts of us go, but it's really about our response to everything that happens in our life. How do we interact with gravity? How do I interact with my instrument? When I'm a performer in an ensemble, how am I using myself in relationship to the conductor, to the music that I'm playing, to the people around me? And so our posture becomes not just about where our shoulders go and where our knees go, but how we think about ourselves actively in any activity that we're doing.
Yeah, that seems really beneficial. And it seems like something that you would imagine most schools would want to prioritize for students, but I'm not sure if this is something that's offered in a lot of music.
There are,
education programs.
there are schools of music that have Alexander technique teachers on their faculty or staff, and there are some places where Alexander technique is required. At some of the top tier conservatories in the United States, you can take 4 years of Alexander technique. In other places, it might be a 1-semester class. Some places offer private lessons with a teacher that could be taken as an elective or as a minor instrument even. So that's something you should definitely check into. And if you're at an institution that does not have Alexander technique, check in your area. Is there an Alexander technique teacher that either you could have a lesson with independently, or maybe they could be invited to give a presentation at your institution so that you and other musicians can learn about the Alexander technique.
Yeah. And what does a one-on-one session with a certified teacher look like?
There are a lot of different ways it can look. For the most standard traditional Alexander technique lessons, you will probably find yourself sitting and standing at a chair and looking at how you use especially your head, neck, and torso in the process of that movement. Let's say you're getting ready to sit in the chair. Do you tighten your neck as you prepare to sit? Or are you able to let your neck have ease and let it have freedom as you make the motion that takes you from standing upright to folding and eventually resting your sitting bones on the chair? And so an Alexander technique teacher who is certified will probably use their hands to guide you through these simple everyday movements, both to learn about your habits so that you can learn about your habits, but also to give you some new experiences of how your body can coordinate with your thinking. and to help you see the places where your habits might be interfering. In those lessons, your teacher may likely teach you constructive rest, which is sometimes called semi-supine or table work. It's a way of resting on your back with your head on resting on a paperback book that's probably about an inch thick and your knees bent towards the ceiling, your feet resting flat on the floor or on the table. And constructive rest is something you can do on your own. It's also something that you can do in a lesson, again, with the guidance of a teacher, to help you release unnecessary tension, to rebalance your muscular action so that your deep postural muscles are starting to do their job more efficiently and with more energy.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of what the Alexander technique focuses on is habits.
Yes.
And I think it's probably the case that people who have more grace and mindfulness of their body in their everyday activities have that same feeling with music. And
100%.
when you're tense and doing things in your daily life, that's probably how you approach playing music too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's actually an assignment that we do in the class at IU, is to pay attention to ourselves in a simple, low-stakes daily activity, something like feeding your pet or folding the laundry, something that if you do it a little bit wrong, the stakes are not high. It really doesn't matter. You can try it again. And what people notice is that when they pay attention to themselves and have this embodied mindfulness of attention, they not only can do the activity successfully, they still get their towels folded or they still feed their cat, but they find ease and a release of unnecessary tension, and they also generally express calm and a feeling of peacefulness in themselves as a result of simply being more mindful in how they move. And in the Alexander technique, there are ways of thinking about and paying attention to yourself that help you not only stop the harmful habits, but to choose ways of being in yourself that are helpful, that are positive, that give you buoyancy and give you poise. And so actually, I'll talk us through one of those right now, if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so this is an exercise that I use with choirs. I use it with private students. I use it with classes. And so wherever you're sitting or standing, just notice where you are making contact with the ground or with your chair. And wherever you're making contact with the ground or with your chair, let yourself be supported by that. So notice if your feet are on the ground, or if your sitting bones are on the chair, or if your back is resting on the back of a chair or in your car. Just notice where you have that contact. And then start to imagine the air that is immediately touching you on your body, on your clothing. Imagine the air behind your neck. Imagine the air around your elbows, under your arms, behind your knees, around your feet, around your legs, the air behind your back, the air in front of you, the air below you, the air above you. So now you have a sense of yourself in 3 dimensions in space. Sometimes I call this like a reverse mold. You are making a mold on the air of yourself. And so now you have a sense of this air that's immediately on the surface of you. Now take that awareness of the air out an inch from your body. So now you're aware of the air 1 inch away from your body in all directions, underneath you, above you, behind you, to the right of you, to the left of you, or in front of you. And if you like, you can take that awareness out 2 inches. And then you can take it out 4 inches. And if you like, you can just keep expanding your awareness of the space around you. And you might notice some really interesting changes. For example, those of you listening with a keen ear might have noticed that my voice changed as I started to think of the space being right on me to being about 2 inches out. My neck lengthened, my back started to have a little more space, and the timbre of my voice and the ease with which I'm speaking just got a little bit better. So this is something you can do anytime, whether you're folding your laundry, or whether you're in your car or walking, or whether you are at your instrument, or whether you're getting ready to sing. You can just notice the space around you, allow gravity to take you on to whatever is supporting you, and then take your awareness of that space out in 3 dimensions, up and down, back and front, right and left. And I don't know, Tanner, did you have any observations in yourself as you were doing this exercise?
Yeah. I noticed this chair isn't as supportive as you noticed when you first came in. And yeah, as you expand outwards, it definitely felt more open as you open up like that. Is this the kind of exercise that you would suggest for students to do like before a practice routine?
Sure. Or in the middle. Say you're working on a difficult passage of music and it's getting a little bit challenging or a little bit frustrating. Stop. Put your instrument down or stand up away from your instrument and just notice the space around you. Allow gravity to take you on to the surface that's supporting you, whether that's the floor or a chair, and let yourself be in the space that's around you. Most of the time I notice when I'm getting frustrated about something and I start to tighten in response to it, I notice that I am compressing myself or contracting myself. And if I take a moment to undo that contracting, then typically my frustration goes away as well. And I'm able to reapproach, I'm ready to come back to my music with more attention and ease and calm so that I'm ready to work on the challenges of that passage rather than compounding them by being tense in the process of practicing.
Yeah. The first exercise talking about I have to do this correct and fast, that's kind of could be the mantra for most music schools.
It sure is.
And do you find it difficult with the students that you work with here to convince them and find ways for them to explore this mindset of I have time? And when a lot of these students have 16 plus credit hours, they have to practice so many things, and you're kind of expected to nail the performance correctly every time. There's really high expectations, and in general, the mindset is that you need to be working really hard and that stress is just kind of part of that. It's almost like a badge of honor, I think.
Yep.
And
I agree with you. Yeah, when I propose this thought experiment to my classes every semester, some of the students respond very positively and say, oh, wow, I had no idea that thinking I have to do it right and I have to do it fast was negatively impacting me. And other students say, but that's just normal. That's just what I have to do. And what I say to that is, as you continue to improve the use of yourself, you will find that you have lots of small moments of time. And that if you're attentive to yourself, you will find places that you can experiment. Here's the clincher for me. Sometimes in order to make a change in our habits, we have to be willing to try something new. In order to try something new, we have to be willing to be wrong, because that something new we're trying might not work. It might not work the first time, but it might work the second time, or it might work the 10th time. And so that is for us as performers, and I speak also as in my role as a teacher and as a conductor, to give musicians space in appropriate, safe places like the practice room and lessons to be wrong, to say, what if I was willing to miss that note? This is something that I come up against a lot when I'm working with students at any institution, not just at IU. They may tighten to try to control pitch accuracy. I need to hit that note exactly right, have it in tune immediately. And often when we play with what would happen if you missed that note on purpose? What if it was out of tune on purpose? What if you let your arm be free and you didn't care if you played the right note? 9 times out of 10, they play the right note and they play it better and more in tune than they did the first time where they were trying to control it. So what I found in myself is as I studied the Alexander technique longer, as I continued my teacher training for 3 years after I had finished my voice studies, I became a better singer, even though I was not actively studying voice. And what I attribute that to is that I had fabulous voice teachers during my undergrad and my graduate degrees who gave me a lot of really solid, really good technique. At that time, I wasn't able to use that technique to its fullest effect because of my habits of tension and collapse. But as I changed my use of myself, as I changed those habits, I was then able to actually apply that technique in the way that they intended for me to apply it. And so I became a better singer because I had that good technique, but I was no longer trying to be right.
Yeah.
It's such an indirect path, and sometimes it requires just a little bit of trust that you as a musician have what you need within you, that you don't have to control every aspect of it to be perfect, but that you can allow yourself to take some risks, and that those risks, if you're willing to take them, usually pay off.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it totally reminds me in my composition classes that I took here, it was a similar thing. My teacher said, like, we were struggling to come up with new material, and he said, well, just try to write something bad. Like, try to bring me a piece that's just terrible. And as soon as you do, you realize that you're trying to come with bad ideas, and they're actually really cool, and you can do great things with them. And
yeah, I think play and experimentation is so important. The more psychology and neuroscience researches play, they're researching it specifically in children, but adult brains and adult bodies like play too. And so when we start to think of our music as work and as serious, something that we can't get wrong, we often tie ourselves up in knots to try to prevent ourselves from failing. But if we can approach it with an attitude of play, still with the same goals of, refined musical sensibilities and accuracy and technical facility, all of the things that you want, but to think of it as play rather than as something that you must perfect, I'm going to bet you're going to make more progress, you'll be more at ease in yourself, and you'll probably enjoy yourself a lot more, which hopefully we all want to enjoy our music.
yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe a lot of us, when we're in music school, are becoming serious musicians. And we have a sense that in order to be serious, we need to take it really seriously. And that, at least for me, manifested in I'm going to be tense and really dig in because that's how I defined being energetic and invested.
Absolutely.
And I think you have to kind of let go of that and realize that you can still take things really seriously and be relaxed and be okay with it not being perfect and still be very serious about your craft.
Absolutely. Take your play seriously.
Ooh, I like that.
Let yourself work towards the things that you desire technically, expressively, musically, in a way that keeps your health of yourself as part of the perfection. Your perfection in your music making, if you want to use that word, which I don't use that very often, might include musicality, technical ability, all of those things, but it can also include how you use yourself. The textbook that we use in our classes here is called Indirect Procedures. It's written by Pedro de Alcantara, who is a cellist as well as an Alexander technique teacher. And he talks about how when we change our perception of technique from being how we play our instrument to how we play ourselves at our instrument, it starts to really change the way we think. It's no longer I tighten my arms to control my bowing and my fingering if you're playing a stringed instrument or whatever instrument you're playing, but it's now how do I coordinate my back and my head and my breath as I use my arms to interact with my instrument. And it really changes how you think about yourself. Your use of yourself is your technique. It's how you use yourself in music making, rather than technique being some sort of codified thing over here that you practice only at your instrument.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really enjoy that. One thing that I've experienced or I guess I'm currently in the process of trying to just relieve tension in my life and how I do things. And I noticed that when I start to peel back those layers, I feel more free, but I also feel more vulnerable. And is that something that you have had other students experience?
I think, that's a really important point. Often when we are using tension in ourselves, it might be a protective response.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, tension and holding ourselves in if you think of performer posture, often that performer posture conveys strength. It might even convey a little bit of aggression or defensiveness. But often our tension makes us feel strong and protected. Sometimes letting go of that extraneous tension causes us to have an emotional response. Sometimes that emotional response is, I feel vulnerable. Sometimes that response is simply, this is weird, or this is unfamiliar. Sometimes it's, this is wrong. There's no way I could play my instrument with this way of using my arms or my whole self. And what I encourage people to do in that situation is to be willing, again, to be wrong, to be willing to play with the unfamiliar first, rather than trying to quickly regain control of the situation by tightening or holding. And what I have experienced over and over again in myself and as a teacher, both an Alexander Technique teacher and as a voice teacher, is when people are willing to stay with that unfamiliar but more buoyant, more easy way of using themselves, usually the technique comes back and it's better. It's if it's a singer, it might feel like there's no way you can sing that note. But if you stay in the process and think, I'm not going to tighten my back as I make the leap to this higher note, or as a pianist, I'm not going to tighten my hip sockets as I make the leap from the lower end of the keyboard to the higher end. At first, you might make a mistake, but as you practice, you'll notice that unfamiliar use becomes more familiar, and then that becomes part of how you play yourself at your instrument. And the technique will come back, the accuracy will come back, but you have to be willing to go through the unfamiliar first.
Yeah, that's just sounds beautiful. And this all seems so helpful, and I want to make sure that people listening have an understanding of how they could get more involved in it, and also maybe the commitment they're getting themselves into, because I know a lot of us as performing musicians don't have a huge budget. And do you think that this is something that you could get a lot of benefit out of, even if you can only do a couple sessions or infrequent sessions?
Right. I consider Alexander Technique to be an important part of self-care for many musicians. It is certainly a part of my self-care. I know that I feel better in my whole self after teaching the Alexander technique than I do when I don't have the opportunity, simply because I, as an Alexander technique teacher, have to think about myself when I'm working with a student so that I am using myself in the most buoyant, free way possible to help this person. So if you're interested in the Alexander technique as a resource for yourself as a musician, first, go online and look for an Alexander technique teacher. I'm affiliated with the American Society for the Alexander Technique, and on our website, amsatonline.org, we're going to have to check that.
Yeah.
On their website, you can find a teacher resource. You can type in your zip code. You can type in your city or state, and you can locate a teacher, and it will tell you how many miles away they are from you. You can look, if there's not an Alexander technique teacher immediately in your area, find a book. There's this wonderful book for musicians, Indirect Procedures by Pedro de Alcantara. There are lots of other wonderful Alexander technique books. And when I'm working with a private student, I encourage people to come for 3 to 6 lessons, either every other week or every week, before they make a decision. And that's based on research. We actually, I'll say this now, the Alexander technique was not invented for musicians.
Right.
It was actually invented or conceived of by a person who was an actor. But in recent years, we've realized that this has very strong implications for chronic back pain, for Parkinson's disease, for many different types of musculoskeletal health. And so a lot of people go to the Alexander technique for relief from chronic pain or as support to their desk jobs if they are a person who works at a desk. So the Alexander technique is a way of helping your whole self feel better. And the research shows that 6 lessons is kind of a basic foundation for the Alexander technique. So I would encourage anyone who can to take, 3 to 6 lessons from a certified Alexander technique teacher. And the amount that you will learn about yourself in those 6 lessons is really quite astounding. And then you'll be able to apply it in your music making. Some people like to continuously study. Some people come for 6 lessons and then they stop and they'll come back for a lesson a few years later or a few months later. So it's really just a way of learning about yourself and learning to pay attention.
I know a lot of musicians, more than we even know about or talk about, struggle with performance anxiety. And is Alexander technique something that can help with that?
Absolutely. Alexander technique helps you first control your responses to any given stimulus. So as you are going through life, of course, back to Psych 101, a stimulus is anything that comes in to your attention. It could be something you see, it could be something you think, it could be something you hear. And the Alexander technique helps us learn to consciously choose our responses to the stimuli of living. And it helps us to be more at ease in our responses so that in a situation like a performance where there might be variables that are out of your control, things like the temperature and the humidity of the room, or whether the audition proctor was nice to you or not. All of these uncontrollable variables that enter your life as a performing musician, you can start to choose your responses to them with more ease as you practice calming your nervous system and choosing your responses to things like, will I sit down in the chair? No, I'm going to choose to pause before I sit down in the chair. I might think of letting my neck be easy before I sit down in the chair. And as you practice those kinds of responses, your ability to choose your responses in more intense or higher stakes situations gets easier. The other thing about the Alexander technique is that we are, as we are reducing tension in our bodies, and as we're changing the way that we think, we're actually calming the nervous system. Some of you might know that in ourselves we have a thing called the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for maintaining homeostasis in our bodies, blood circulation, digestion, breathing, all that kind of stuff. And the response of our autonomic nervous system that's called the fight, flight, freeze, or faint response. That is your sympathetic nervous system that gets you ready for action. Something like, I'm gonna fight this bear that I just ran into when I was walking down the street.
Or flee from said bear,
Or
in my
flee
case.
from said bear, or freeze and hope the bear doesn't notice me, or play dead and hope the bear just walks on by. That's our sympathetic nervous system. And that part of our nervous system is very helpful when we are faced with a bear. One of the what's the word I want? One of the unfortunate side effects of that is that our nervous system might not be able to tell the difference between a threat that we perceive, which is a bear, and a threat which we perceive, which is an audition panel.
Yeah.
And so not everyone experiences performance anxiety in the same ways. People have many different performance anxiety responses. But overall, what we want to be doing is to be calming our nervous system so that it's not in high alert, that it's not making us think we have to run away from this threat that's in front of us. And as you practice the Alexander technique, you'll learn skills and tools for engaging the calming part of your autonomic nervous system, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system. And so Alexander technique helps us not only to choose our responses to whatever stimulus is in front of us, but to, as we grow in our understanding of our own use, to have a less reactive nervous system overall, so that we're no longer quite so reactive to stimuli that we might perceive as negative.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you'll never again feel anxious, but that you will have some different skills and some different tools for managing it and for hopefully reducing its impact on you as a performer.
Okay. Very cool. And you've talked about how usually this is maybe a one-on-one lesson kind of thing, but is it effective to use in an ensemble or group setting, and how do you go about implementing these techniques on top of, focusing on the music and pushing both of those things along?
Right. So Alexander technique instruction is most effective and efficient one-on-one because the Alexander teacher can really look at your individual habits and help you make choices about your individual situation. But group instruction still can be very useful. The class that I teach here at IU is a group class, and they do receive a little bit of one-on-one, but it's mostly group instruction. As an ensemble director, I have found all kinds of places in my ensemble rehearsal that I can start to change the way that I approach leading rehearsal, that I can change the way I approach our rehearsal and performance process to be able to incorporate some of these ideas from the Alexander technique that have been so helpful to me as a singer and as a person. Some of these places are just giving your ensemble time. Instead of rushing into the next thing, encouraging some mindful pauses, saying, before we go to measure 74, would everyone please notice how your feet are supported by the floor? And that, in and of itself, completely changes the tone of rehearsal. Because you've gone from one of, okay, we have to do the next right thing, and then we have to do the next right thing, to, oh, I have time to think about myself. And it changes the tone of one of pressure into one of, we're just exploring, we're just experimenting together. When I am giving vocal technique instructions to a chorus, I have changed the way that I talk about the voice and that I talk about the use of a body in singing, to be more indirect, to ask people to notice what's happening with themselves rather than giving them things to do. There's an aspect of the Alexander Technique process that we haven't talked about directly yet, but it's in that first exercise we did. And it is our tendency as humans to be so set on a goal that we are willing to do almost anything to meet that goal. Sometimes that goal is, I'm going to sit in a chair. And that's not a very high stakes goal, but I still might be very focused on sitting in the chair to the extent that I start to overshift my weight back towards the chair, or I might tighten down towards the chair, neither of which is actually necessary for getting into a chair, and which may over time compound harmful tensions that I have in myself. In the case of musicians, any goal that we have, like, I'm going to play this note in tune, or we're going to sing this chord in tune, or play this chord in tune, those can become a goal that we start to really focus on, and what Alexander would have called end gain towards, the idea of trying to gain, G-A-I-N, gain your end at all costs. And end gaining is the root for me, in my understanding, of why we rush, of why we tighten, of why we push, because we are focused on, I'm going to do that thing. Sometimes it can be an overarching goal. I want to get my degree. I want to get a job. I want to win this audition so that I have a career. And those kinds of goals can become so all-encompassing that we are willing to misuse ourselves in order to achieve them. And that misuse may actually prevent us from reaching the very goal that we want to reach. So the antidote to end gaining is to stay in the process, or what Alexander called the means whereby you would do any activity. And those parts of staying in the process are to be aware of what you're doing, to be able to stop and to give a positive no or a non-doing attitude to what you're engaged in. So when you're sitting in a chair, for example, you might say, I'm not going to sit in the chair, before you say, now I'll let myself fold at my knees and hips. And the reason that this is an important part of the process is that it allows us to stop and to identify these harmful tensions before they start. That's how we actually unlearn our habits, is by becoming aware of them, by stopping, by practicing a positive no or some non-doing around that habit, and then choosing our direction, how we're going to think about ourselves in space, how we're going to organize our thoughts in a way that is constructive and that gives us buoyancy. So in a rehearsal, if we are pushing towards our performance in 2 weeks, I, as your conductor, might be tempted to end gain. I might be very tempted to make sure we cover as much as possible in every rehearsal and get everything as perfect as it can be as soon as possible. But in that process, I might encourage the folks in my ensemble to use unnecessary tension and strain to achieve that goal. And if I, as the ensemble director, am able to stay in the process with them, to give them some prompts to be at ease in themselves in the process of achieving musical excellence, then we'll all get there together, probably a little bit faster than we would have with the pushing pressure way.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful thing to be able to stay in the process of music making, both as an individual, on your own, in your practice room or in your ensemble rehearsals, and in a larger group, such as an orchestra or a chorus.
Yeah, that's really cool. And the one thought that occurred to me was that the importance of seeing someone one-on-one and taking a few weeks isn't just so that you can get all these things. It probably takes the instructor time to learn your habits as well, right? And to be able to address them.
It does. I mean, I know that the students I've worked with longer, I'm much more familiar with their habits than I would be with a new student. What's really great for me as an Alexander Technique teacher is that I practice the Alexander Technique on myself when I am teaching. So I am becoming aware of myself. I notice if I am end gaining towards a particular goal. That goal could be, I really want the student to use less tension in their neck. And so I have to say no to my desire to try and fix what's going on in the student. And so honestly, when I work with a beginning student, I learn a lot about their habits, and it does refine over time, but I'm still trying to approach every lesson with fresh eyes so that I'm able to see something new and to be able to respond in the moment to that student in the most constructive way, rather than bringing my preconceived ideas about what they might need to do or not do into the lesson.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've never considered being goal-oriented, which is something I've always been. I've had goals, but I've never considered it on a small level like this of I'm goal-oriented to just do these small tasks.
Yeah, so we're sitting in a room with a percussion setup here, and maybe I have a goal of playing the cymbal to my right. And I might, as part of that process, lean to my right, tighten my right shoulder to bring my whole self over to that right cymbal, rather than coordinating myself in a way to let my stick meet the cymbal by extending my arm all the way from my back with the full support of my postural muscles. And so it can be these minute goals, or it can be overarching large goals. And we notice over time how our preconceived ideas of what we have to do influence our actions and our thoughts just as much as being overly focused on a goal might interfere with actually achieving the result we want.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I love all that. Thank you so much for sharing all this.
Sure.
Do you think it would be helpful to maybe walk people through some of this constructive rest that you
Sure.
talked about?
Yeah. So constructive rest is a practice that people can do on their own. Daily, if you like, or multiple times a day, if you like. The folks in my classes often start out the semester thinking, oh, what is this strange thing we're going to do lying down in class? Isn't that a waste of time? But they often express as the class goes on that it has become one of the most important parts of the class. So for those of you who are going to try this, this is one you can't do while you're driving. You will want to find a relatively undisturbed space. It doesn't have to be totally quiet. It doesn't have to be dark, just undisturbed, a place where you can safely lay on the floor. And using a yoga mat or a couple of large towels on the floor, or a carpet or a rug, so that it is comfortable for you to lay down on the floor. I encourage people not to lie on a mattress or on a couch, because those don't really give you the same support that lying on a floor, or, of course, if you have a massage table at your convenience, then you can use that. But something like a yoga mat on the floor is great. Before you lie down, find a paperback book of anywhere between a 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches in height, maybe more. I like to joke that, Handel's Messiah is always a nice score to have around for resting your head on when you're not practicing the music. But any paperback book or score that you have that's about 1 inch, 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches thick. And take that with you to your mat. And then before you lie down on the floor, just notice yourself on your feet, standing on your feet, and notice that the floor is supporting you. You'll want to do this without shoes on. So if you're in your socks, just notice how your feet are able to release onto the floor. And then you can think of allowing yourself to lighten, not to stretch, but to lighten, so that you can fold and With your hands and knees on the ground, you can then roll onto your back to rest on the mat. Place your book or your score under the back of your head so that the back of your head is supported by the book. And then you can bend your knees so that your feet are resting flat on the floor. You might find that it's difficult to keep your knees bent without tightening them. And so if that is difficult for you, you're welcome to scoot yourself up to a chair and rest your lower legs on the seat of a chair or a couch so that your legs can get some support. But again, with your back on the floor and your head on a small book of some kind. The book is there to help work with the connection of the skull, spine, and torso, all the way down to the pelvis. You might play with, if you take the book away, you'll notice that there might be a little compression at the back of your head where your top of your spine meets your skull. And so the book is there to help give that some ease and some support so that you can let yourself rest on that surface with freedom. Now that you're lying in semi-supine, supine just means on your back, semi means with your legs bent, take a moment just to stop and just notice, where are my points of contact with the floor? My shoulder blades, the back of my ribs, the back of my pelvis, the soles of my feet, the back of my head. All of those places, wherever you notice yourself making contact, allow gravity to take you onto the floor at that point, whether it's your pelvis or your shoulders, or if your arms are bent with your hands resting on your torso, it might be your elbows. Or if your hands are at your sides and your arms are out long, it might be your whole arm. Wherever you notice, allow yourself to be supported by the floor. And in the simplest version of constructive rest, this is what you do. You just notice yourself and your points of contact. You don't try to lengthen. You don't try to stretch. You don't try to flatten yourself. You just allow gravity to take you onto the surface that is supporting you. You might notice your breath, but don't interfere with your breath. Don't try to have long breaths or short breaths. Just notice your breath. Notice how your body moves when your breath goes out, and how it moves when the breath comes back in. I encourage folks to leave their eyes open. If you are taking in what's around you with your eyes open, that really does help you to coordinate yourself in space. If you are really tired, just go find your bed and take a nap. That's fine. But when you are doing constructive rest, a gentle alertness is preferable because you're wanting to learn about yourself. You're wanting to pay attention. You can try the expanding space exercise that we did earlier. You can notice the space below you, where you're meeting the ground. You can notice the space above you. You can notice the space on either side of you, above your head, below your feet, around your knees, and notice if that is different now that you're lying down as opposed to standing or sitting, which you may have been when you practiced it the first time. And then notice that space. And if you like, take your awareness of the space around you out an inch, 2 inches if you like, so that you are thinking of yourself in 3 dimensions as you are supported by the floor. And that is constructive rest. And you can do that for 5 minutes. You can do it for 10 minutes. If you really like lying down a long time, you're welcome to lie down as long as you like. But I encourage folks to try to incorporate 5 to 10 minutes of constructive rest into their daily routine on a regular basis. Whether that is in the morning before you begin your activities for the day, whether it's in the middle of the day as a respite and a break and a refuge. I call constructive rest sometimes. It's a refuge from whatever else is going on. Whether you do it before you begin to practice. When I started lying down at the beginning of warming up, my practice sessions just magically, it seemed, became easier. But that's because I was starting fresh. I was starting with ease in my whole self rather than that rushing forward into the activities of practicing. Okay, now I've got to warm up. Now I have to work on this repertoire. I have to work on these exercises. So doing a few minutes of constructive rest might change your practice. You might try it in the green room before a performance. You might try it after a performance. If you've done a very long performance, make sure that you allow yourself time to recover and let yourself come back to a neutral, easy way of being in yourself before you go on to whatever is next. So many performers swear by constructive rest as a way to care for yourself and prepare for performances, as well as a way to care for yourself outside of performing just in the course of daily life. So I hope if this listening on the audio doesn't work for you, I do have a resource on my website where you can read the instructions for constructive rest and follow that on your own, even away from the audio.
Yeah. Actually, when I had reached out to you to be on the podcast, I found that on your website and tried it out. And it was interesting. I wasn't really sure exactly what to be getting out of it. I was always doing it. And then I got up to walk to my kitchen and I was like, whoa, this feels great. As soon as I went to do an action, I totally just felt different. And that was really cool.
Absolutely. Sometimes we think that stopping or taking time has no purpose. But usually what we find when we allow ourselves to stop, to take a pause, or to give ourselves time to either rest or to complete an action, or sometimes simply just to exhale, our way of being in the rest of our activities throughout the day is significantly changed. And so that little pause, whether that's 5 minutes of constructive rest or just stopping to notice, where's my support? How am I using myself in this space around me? That can have a profound impact on the rest of your life and your music making.
Yeah, so cool. Well, that's going to bring us to our coda question round, which is 5 short answer questions for every guest that we do before we take the coda and get out of here. And the first one is, what is your go-to feel-good album?
Oh boy, my go-to feel-good album. I absolutely love Trio Medieval's album Folk Songs, which is an album of Norwegian traditional music in new arrangements for 3 voices and percussion. It is just astounding. It was Grammy nominated, but that is an album that I go to over and over again just for my own inspiration and vibrancy of listening to these amazing performers and their music.
Cool. Who's a musician in your life who is living a particularly healthy, happy, and fulfilling life?
I think I'm going to go with my first gut reaction, which was admiring someone like Yo-Yo Ma, who has really allowed his musicianship to expand beyond simply giving performances to how he is interacting culturally and to be pushing the boundaries and exploring what does music mean in the world? How can music be harnessed as a force for good in the world, not just simply as something that is beautiful and that we enjoy and that is fun or rewarding to do, but that can actually be used as a positive force for connection among people.
Yeah. Oh, that is so true. I love that a lot. The next one is, what advice would you give to a young musician who's just starting their career?
Give yourself time. That's one I have to remind myself of every day. But try to remember that you have time, that you don't have to make it to, I'm going to use this word with quotes around it, the top as fast as possible, that you can be in your own process and that your own process is beautiful and valuable and that your journey is worthwhile and that you can give yourself the time and the space and the grace to explore and take care of yourself as part of your journey of music making.
Yeah, yeah. What's a great piece of advice about happiness that you've received?
For me, I think the advice to be able to practice gratitude in every situation has been some of the most transformative advice about happiness. We don't have to truly be grateful for every situation, but we can always, I think, we can always find something, even if it's small, that we can notice and practice a little gratitude for. And sometimes just noticing that one small thing that we can be grateful for changes a situation from one that feels hopeless and feels debilitatingly awful to one that I know is maybe not so great right now, but is going to pass. And so just like practicing your use in yourself, how you coordinate your arms when you're at your instrument, the more you practice gratitude, the easier it is to find those moments. I know I'm not great at it, but I keep practicing. And so that advice to just notice what's something small that I can be grateful for. Right now, I'm grateful that before I came to this interview, I could just walk across the street and get some coffee. Isn't that cool? That I could just walk across the street and get some coffee and then come to this recording? That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm really grateful that I could do that. And so I could just go on and on. But finding little things or big things that you're grateful for is a huge piece, I think, of happiness and balance in a musician's life, or hopefully in anyone's life.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. And the last one is, what do you think your purpose as a musician is?
Oh, wow. I don't know yet.
Cool.
I don't think it's
Yeah.
something I'm going to know until later, and we can, see it in retrospect.
Yeah.
I would hope that some of my work is helping musicians to be more at ease in themselves and more balanced in their humanity. And the outcome of that is that we will be creating spaces for connection and spaces for renewal and spaces to experience the transformative power of beauty. In my role as a choral conductor, I think very seriously about why people should listen to music. Is it just for enjoyment and entertainment? Or is there something that can allow us to start healing the divisions in our world and healing the great pain in our world through the practice of either making music together or experiencing music as a balm and as beauty that brings transformation and healing. So I don't know, but I hope that might be part of it.
Yeah. No, that's great. This has all been wonderful, and I've gotten so much out of it. And before we're done, if you want, you can let people know where they can find more information about you online or certain services or opportunities that you want to make people aware of.
Sure.
You can do that.
So my current website is www.sound-direction.com, sounddirection.com with a hyphen in the middle. And you can also just Google me, Meagan, Meagan Johnson, Johnsson. And so you can find me. I teach mostly in Indianapolis, also in Bloomington, Indiana. And if you missed it before, find an Alexander Technique teacher wherever you are. You can go to amsatonline.org to find a teacher, or again, just use your internet search engine to look for an Alexander Technique certified teacher near you.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, Tanner. This has been great.
All right, that does it for this week's episode of the Happy Musicians Podcast. Right now we're listening to Orchard Invisible, which is a traditional Welsh proverb that Meagan Johnson has set for 4-part women's chorus, and it's being sung. This is the premiere performance in 2014 by the Illinois-based choir Amasong. That's right, Meagan also arranges and composes amazing works, and you can purchase those for your own ensemble at her website. Everything we've talked about on the show you can find links to from our website, thehappymusicians.com. You can also find us on social media at The Happy Musicians. And as always, I encourage you to let your friends know about the show if you think they can get value out of it. Let them know, share it on your own social medias. Please don't hesitate to subscribe to the show and leave us a review. It goes such a long way. I want to thank you all for your time and your attention and for being here and taking this time for yourself to grow as a person. Thank you so much, and stay happy.